They stood trembling on the auction block, too tall, too poor, too unwanted. But just before the hammer dropped, one voice rose above the crowd. And in that moment, everything changed. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip against the dry midday heat. $5. Do I hear $5 for the whole lot? The crowd, restless and cruel, murmured with stifled laughter. The sun bore down on the dusty square like judgment itself, peeling paint off the courthouse columns, drying every well of decency left in town. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts. Men leaned on hitching posts with arms folded and brows raised, and no one stepped forward. Not yet. On the platform stood a woman whose size made her impossible to ignore, though she did her best to shrink into the shadow of the wooden beam above her. Her name was Hester Boone, and next to her stood 4 children, stair-stepped in height but all visibly hers, broad-shouldered, solemn-eyed, and trembling. She held the youngest, a chubby toddler with a mop of pale hair, while the others clung to one another like timber bracing against flood. None of them spoke. None dared. "Last chance," barked the auctioneer, his voice faltering in the heat. "A full family, strong backs, good eaters. Make them yours for $5 and save yourself the trouble of hiring help all season." A few men chuckled. "They eat more than they're worth," someone muttered. "Whole gang of giants." Hester didn't flinch, not when the word giants cut the air like a blade. She'd heard worse. She'd endured worse. The town of Larkspur had always seen her as too much, too tall, too loud, too everything. And when her husband died dragging his broken leg behind a failed mule cart, the townsfolk waited exactly 3 days before coming with questions about debts and land titles. Now here she stood, barefoot on splintered boards, her family priced at $1 per soul. Shame clung to her like sweat, but she lifted her chin anyway. The children needed her to be steel, even if she felt like crumbling clay. A gust of wind blew grit through the square, stirring bonnets and lifting the edge of Hester's worn skirt. Her second eldest, a boy of about 11 named Amos, reached to tuck it down, his brown hands trembling. The smallest girl, Ruthie, leaned into his side. Ezra, the oldest at 15, stood stone still, jaw clenched, one hand behind his siblings, backs as if he could shield them all from the crowd. No one bid, not a single voice, not until. "They're mine." The words didn't echo. They didn't shout. They simply fell, low, steady, absolute, and yet the entire crowd turned toward them as if a cannon had gone off. At the edge of the square, a man sat astride a dusty bay horse, wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He wore no badge, no shine of wealth or power, just a worn coat and boots that had seen every mile of the frontier. His name was Tobias Brand, and though most had forgotten it, those old enough to remember knew he hadn't spoken in a public square since the day his wife died giving birth to a child that didn't make it through the night. The auctioneer blinked. "Pardon." Tobias swung down from his horse, boots thudding against the earth. "I said they're mine." "You gonna pay $5 for the lot?" "I'll pay 10. The crowd stirred. Even the mocking voices fell into silence, necks craning as Tobias stepped forward. "Names on the bill," the auctioneer mumbled, now fumbling for paper. "State says they're unclaimed. Technically the property of, well, no one. You sure about this, mister?" Tobias ignored him. His eyes were on the family, on Hester Boone, who now stared at him like he was some long-forgotten ghost. "I don't need your name," he said quietly to her. "You want out of this, come with me." Hester didn't move at first, didn't speak. Her arms tightened around the toddler. "Ma," Amos whispered. Ezra narrowed his eyes. "Who is he?" "I don't know," she said, but something in her voice cracked. Not fear, not hope either. Just the sound a woman makes when the ground under her shifts and she doesn't know yet if it's a landslide or salvation. Tobias extended his hand, not to her but to Ezra. The boy looked at it, jaw flexing. A muscle jumped in his cheek. Then slowly he stepped off the block and took it. That was enough. They walked off that platform not with chains or shame, but side by side with a stranger. Tobias lifted the toddler into his arms without asking. The child didn't cry, just nestled into his chest like he'd belonged there all along. Hester followed with the others, passing through a corridor of silence. The townsfolk parted without speaking. A few women turned their faces away. One man spat in the dust, but Tobias didn't flinch. By the time they reached the horse, Tobias had already untied his pack mule and gestured for the children to load what little they had. Ezra helped Amos onto the back of the mule. Hester held Ruthie close. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. Tobias didn't look at her. "Home." The word dropped heavy, final. Not a question, not a promise, just a direction. They rode west for hours, saying little. The land unfurled in waves of golden grass and dry scrub, broken only by the shadow of hawks circling above. Hester watched Tobias from behind, trying to understand the man who'd bought them not like cattle, but like kin. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer sympathy or judgment, just rode with the quiet of a man who had lost more than he could ever say aloud. By nightfall they reached the edge of a small valley. A cabin sat nestled between two sycamores, its roof patched with tin, its porch sagging but sturdy. A pen of goats bleated from the far side, and smoke curled from a chimney like a thread of welcome. Tobias dismounted first, held his arms out to Ruthie, who reached for him instinctively. Then he turned to Hester and the boys. "This place has been empty too long," he said. "You can fill it if you want. If not, I'll find somewhere else for you." Hester stared at the cabin, at the fence, the woodpile, the chickens roosting in a crooked hutch. "You live here?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "Didn't see the point after a while. Maybe I do now." Ezra stepped forward. "We'll work. We won't be dead weight." Tobias looked at the boy. "I didn't bring you here to work." "Then why?" Tobias didn't answer. They moved inside that night, awkward, unsure. The cabin had 3 rooms. Tobias gave them all and slept by the fire. He chopped wood by dawn, cooked cornbread and eggs without a word. Ruthie giggled for the first time in days when he let her collect eggs in a too-big basket. By the 3rd day, the children no longer jumped when the wind howled. By the 5th, Hester started to hum while she swept. Ezra fixed the gate. Amos learned to split logs, and Tobias sat on the porch carving a small figure out of pine. He didn't speak much, but he watched, and when the sun set each night, he made sure the lamp stayed lit until the last child had fallen asleep. But peace never stays long in a place where envy thrives. Because on the 7th day, someone came riding fast from town, bringing dust and news, and it wasn't good. The rider didn't knock. He came thundering down the slope like a storm on horseback, dust pluming behind him, sweat streaking the sides of his gelding. Tobias was in the field with Ezra and Amos, stacking kindling near the shed when he saw the figure tear across the ridge. He didn't move, just watched as the man pulled hard on the reins and brought the horse to a skidding stop not 20 feet from the cabin door. Hester had already stepped onto the porch, broom in hand, her body coiled with tension. The rider yanked off his hat, revealing a sharp-nosed man with a neck too long for his body and a voice that grated like broken gravel. "Name S. Darby Finch," he said, hopping down. "County Records Officer. Got something that belongs to me." Tobias stepped forward, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You're not on this land's deed." "I ain't talking land," Darby snapped. He jabbed a finger toward Hester. That woman, them kids, you got no legal claim. Paperwork ain't filed proper. That family was scheduled for reassignment to Greeley. Industrial labor. You bought livestock, mister, not citizens. That don't hold." Ezra stepped between Darby and the porch like it was instinct, like he'd already measured the distance and knew what he'd do if the man tried to climb the steps. Tobias didn't stop him. "What do you want exactly?" Tobias asked, voice still quiet but lower now. He didn't threaten, he never had to. "I want what's owed," Darby said, tugging a folded paper from his satchel. "State's orders. That family was under assessment, not clearance. The auction was premature. Some clerk jumped the gun. They were supposed to be moved to industrial service. Contracts pending." "You're late," Tobias said. "They're here now." Darby smirked. "And you think that means anything?" Tobias didn't reply. He just stepped up onto the porch, past Ezra, and stood beside Hester. Darby unfolded the paper and read something aloud about jurisdiction, reclamation, family units, and transit rights. He used words Tobias had no interest in hearing. Hester's hands gripped the railing until her knuckles turned pale. Ruthie was just inside, peeking through a crack in the door. Tobias waited until Darby finished. Then said no. Darby blinked. "No." "You heard me." Darby shoved the paper forward. "This is state verified. You think you can just say no?" Tobias didn't touch the paper. They're not property, not anymore, and they're not going anywhere. Darby's jaw twitched. You think I won't bring the law down here? You think I care if you do? The air between them thickened. Darby's eyes flicked toward Ezra, who hadn't budged, then to Amos in the yard, splitting wood with hands too small for the axe but determination too big for his years. Finally, he looked back at Tobias, measuring him again, this time slower. You always been this stupid, Darby muttered. No, Tobias said, but I've always been this sure. That's when Darby made a mistake. He stepped onto the first stair of the porch. Hester moved, just a fraction, just enough. Tobias didn't raise a hand, didn't shout, but Ezra did. His voice sliced the tension. Don't, he said, firm, not angry. You don't touch my ma. Darby looked down at the boy, and for a second something flickered in his eyes. Maybe recognition, maybe fear. He stepped back. This ain't over, he spat. They'll come for you. Tobias shrugged. Let 'em bring God with them, won't matter. Darby mounted, wheeled the horse, and kicked dust into the sky as he rode off. The silence afterward was heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of decisions made. Inside, Ruthie ran to Hester and buried her face in her mother's legs. Amos dropped the axe and came to the porch. Tobias stood still as stone. Ezra finally asked, Who's gonna come next? Tobias turned and looked him square in the eye. The kind of men who think $5 can buy a soul. That night the cabin didn't feel as warm. The fire burned, but every creak in the floorboards made Hester flinch. She sat with Ruthie in her lap, brushing tangles from the child's hair with gentle hands. Tobias stood near the window, watching the shadows stretch across the hills. We can leave, Hester whispered after the children had gone to bed. Start somewhere else, somewhere smaller. Tobias didn't turn. Wouldn't matter. Paper follows people, especially the ones nobody's supposed to care about. I don't want them hurt, she said. I know. You barely know us. I know enough. She watched his back, how still he held himself, how silent he stayed. You lost someone, she said softly. Two, he replied after a moment. Hester didn't ask more. She knew the kind of silence grief required. Why did you take us? She asked instead. Tobias finally turned, because no one else would. She looked away. That's not enough. No, he agreed, but it's a start. By the third day after Darby's visit, they saw the first rider. A scout, maybe. He didn't come close, just hovered on the ridge with binoculars, then vanished by dusk. The fourth day the chickens were gone. Ruthie cried. Tobias found feathers stretching into the woods. No prints, just a message. The fifth day a letter arrived pinned to the post by a knife. No signature, no threats, just one line. Give them back before the cost rises. Tobias burned it in the stove. Ezra started sleeping near the door with a shovel beside him. Amos sharpened sticks and hid them in the loft. Hester packed bags she didn't want to use. The toddler whimpered at night, waking from dreams with no name. But they stayed. Because fear only wins when you stop building in its shadow. And they built. They fixed the fence, repaired the roof, dug a second well. Tobias taught Amos how to set traps, taught Ezra how to cut wood without splitting the grain wrong, taught Ruthie how to listen to the wind. Hester cooked, cleaned, patched clothes, and every now and then, when no one was watching, sang. It was on the 9th day that Tobias found footprints near the barn. Not horses, boots, heavy. He said nothing to the others. But that night, he moved his cot into the hallway between their bedrooms. He slept with his shotgun laid across his chest. On the 10th day, Ruthie found a copper coin in the henhouse. Ezra swore he'd checked it that morning. Tobias examined the coin. Minted recent. City stamp. They were being watched. That night, he told Hester the truth. I thought I buried my wife alone, he said, but someone was there. A man I'd seen before, real estate man, wanted my land, thought grief made it easier to negotiate. I buried him the next morning too, not deep. Hester didn't flinch. Now they want more than land, Tobias said. They want control, every inch, every person. And what do you want? He looked at her, really looked. A reason. Her lips parted, then closed. That night no one slept sound. And the next morning, on the 11th day, they saw the smoke rising from the east. Not chimney smoke. Fire. It rose like a signal, thick, black, angry smoke clawing at the pale dawn sky from the east ridge. Hester was the first to see it. She stood in the doorway with her hands still wet from washing the breakfast pot, her breath catching in her throat. The wind carried the scent a moment later, burnt timber, scorched brush, something unnatural. Not wildfire. No lightning. No dry spark. This was a fire set by hands. Tobias was already halfway to the barn before she could call his name. Ezra followed with a shovel, barefoot and still tucking in his shirt. Amos grabbed the water buckets without being told. It was routine now, no panic, just grim efficiency. In the distance, the smoke thickened, a column rising where the Candler farm used to sit. The family had moved out a year ago, but the barn still stood, or had. By the time Tobias returned with the mule saddled, the smoke was drifting westward, staining the horizon like a bruise. He didn't need to say anything. Hester met his eyes, gave one slow nod and turned back to gather the children. Ezra climbed up behind Tobias. They left without breakfast, without goodbye. The ride east was silent. The land stretched out bare and brown, brittle from weeks without rain. As they crested the final ridge, Tobias pulled the mule to a stop. Below, the Candler barn lay in cinders, still smoldering. The fields around it were blackened, nothing but soot and cracked earth. And on the ground, carved crudely into the dirt, was a message. "Next time it's your roof." Ezra stared. They burned it to send a message. Tobias said nothing. He scanned the ridgeline. No riders, no watchers, just the emptiness of threat left behind. "Should we go to the sheriff?" Ezra asked after a long pause. Tobias turned to him. "What sheriff?" It was true. The last man to wear the badge in Larkspur had left 2 months ago after the town voted to cut his pay. Said there was no need for law when folks could police themselves. That was fine, until people like Darby Finch started deciding who belonged and who didn't. They returned just after noon. Hester was tending the fire, Ruthie curled against her leg. Amos had been digging near the goat pen, a new ditch started for runoff. The toddler, Millie, was asleep inside, cheeks flushed with the heat. When Ezra told them what they'd found, Amos dropped his shovel. Ruthie started to cry. Hester didn't. She just stood and took a long breath, her eyes tracking the horizon. "We need to pack," she said softly. "No," Tobias answered. "We can't stay here, not if they." "No," he repeated more firmly this time. "They'll follow. Doesn't matter where we run. We make a stand here or we spend our lives hiding." Ezra stepped forward. "We can fight, right? We can make traps, defend it." Amos nodded eagerly. "Like with the snares you showed us, and the spikes." Tobias looked at them. Young, brave, too brave. "I don't want you boys in a fight," he said. Ezra crossed his arms. "We're already in one." It was true, they all knew it, and so the preparations began. Tobias drew a map of the property in the dirt. He showed Ezra where the fence was weakest, where someone could sneak through the creek at night. Amos set up tripwires with cowbells and broken glass. Hester began boiling water to store in buckets, just in case fire came closer next time. Ruthie gathered eggs, quietly singing to herself under her breath. But tension wore on them all. Meals went half-eaten. Sleep came in fits. Millie cried more at night now, waking everyone with those soft, lost sobs that stabbed through the dark. And Tobias watched the road. Always the road. On the 5th night after the fire, it came. Not men on horseback. Not fire. Worse. Paper. An envelope nailed to the cabin door, sealed in red wax with the symbol of the Larkspur Development Council. Tobias found it before dawn. He didn't open it immediately. He stared at it, fingers tight around the wood. Then he walked inside, tore the seal, and unfolded the letter. The words were polite, elegant, and laced with poison. To Mr. Tobias Brand. It has come to our attention that you have taken unlawful possession of 4 minors and an unlicensed female subject formerly under county oversight. We regret to inform you that your appeal for ownership, should such an appeal exist, is invalid under the revised Ordinance of Displaced Persons, Article 13, Section C. To avoid further misunderstanding or necessary escalation, we ask that you surrender the aforementioned individuals to the care of the County Industrial Council by sundown on the 15th. Failure to comply will result in forfeiture of land, assets, and legal immunity. Sincerely, Dr. Luther Wainwright, Chairman, Larkspur Development Council. Hester read the letter 3 times, folded it, unfolded it, then walked outside and fed the goats like it was any other day. But when Tobias joined her, she didn't speak. Not until he stood beside her, watching the morning sun rise over a world that seemed more cruel than it ever had a right to be. "They'll take us," she said, "won't they?" Tobias's jaw flexed. "Not if I'm standing." "And when you fall?" He didn't answer. "I don't want my children to grow up running," she whispered, "but I don't want them buried either." "I know." She turned to him. "Why do you keep fighting for us?" "Because somebody should have fought for my wife," he said, "and didn't." That night Tobias packed a bag, took only what he needed: maps, the shotgun, a pocket full of coins, and the old ring his wife had worn. He left Ezra in charge, told him to bar the doors, keep the fire low, and wait for 2 days. No longer. If he didn't return by the 3rd, they were to take the mule and ride west until the trees thickened and the air turned cool. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't need to. Hester stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him disappear down the trail with the slow resolve of a man walking into something he'd already made peace with. Ezra stood beside her, silent. Amos cried, but only after Tobias was out of sight. By the time morning came, Tobias had reached Larkspur. And the town had changed. Signs of the old had been scraped off buildings. A new flag flew above the council house, deep red, with a black circle in the center. Men in polished boots stood on corners with rifles. The sheriff's office was boarded shut. And Dr. Luther Wainwright's name was painted across the post office door. Tobias didn't pause. He tied his mule outside the general store, walked into the council house, and waited. It didn't take long. They always watched for trouble. 2 men approached in matching coats, one with a clipboard, the other with a baton. They asked his name. He gave it. Tobias Brand. That was all it took. They brought him into the back room, where Dr. Wainwright waited behind a desk so polished it gleamed. The man was tall, narrow, with skin that looked pale even in candlelight. He smiled like someone who knew he already owned you. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, gesturing for Tobias to sit. "I'm here to talk." "Oh, I don't think we need to talk," Wainwright said, folding his hands. "You have something we want, you'll give it to us. That's how the world works." Tobias didn't sit. "You want to own them," he said flatly. "They're already owned. What you did was quaint, heroic even, but law is law." Tobias leaned forward. "I'm not asking." Wainwright's smile grew colder. "That's where you misunderstand me. You see, we don't negotiate with relics. We absorb or we remove." He pulled a file from a drawer, opened it, showed Tobias a page with Hester's name, the children's names, birth dates, blood types, designations. "Is this how you sleep at night?" Tobias asked quietly, turning families into inventory. "No," Wainwright said, shutting the folder. "I sleep well because I never open the file twice." Tobias stared at him, then turned and walked out. Wainwright didn't stop him. He didn't have to. Because by the time Tobias reached his mule, he knew. They wouldn't wait for sundown. They were coming tonight. The sky was already bruising purple by the time Tobias reached the southern ridge, and the air carried the scent of dust, sweat, and something else, movement. The kind of movement that rustled brush before you saw it, that unsettled the birds and made the wind hesitate. He rode low, taking back trails that twisted through dry arroyos and long-forgotten cattle tracks. His mule was tired but steady. Tobias was neither. He didn't race. He couldn't afford to burn the animal out. But the urgency roared inside him, louder than hoofbeats, louder than the whistle of wind past his ears. He knew what was coming. The look on Wainwright's face hadn't been smug or angry. It had been final. The look of a man who had already signed the orders and didn't expect to hear Tobias's name again. A man who thought authority made him immortal. Tobias wasn't immortal, but he'd learned what men like Wainwright always forgot. When you try to crush a family, you don't just make enemies. You forge something stronger than anger. You forge resolve. The valley came into view just as the last gold light drained from the sky. Smoke still rose gently from the cabin chimney, and he could see the faint flicker of lantern light through the window. The porch was dark, quiet, no signs of movement, no figures in the yard, no shouting. That scared him more than gunfire. He dismounted behind the shed, tying the mule beneath the low overhang and drawing his shotgun from the saddle loop. The weight in his hands was familiar now, wood-worn smooth from years of use, barrel cold and precise. He moved quickly but quietly, staying close to the trees, eyes scanning the field. And then he saw it. A shadow too tall for a bush, too still for wind, moved near the far fence. Then another. He crouched. There were at least 5. Armed. Spaced in a loose crescent, advancing slowly toward the house, trained. He hadn't beaten them back. He'd arrived just in time to watch the trap snap shut. Tobias crept low toward the root cellar where the ground gave cover. He reached the back of the house just as a twig cracked to his right. He froze. A figure passed within 20 feet of him, rifle across the chest, uniform neat. Tobias could smell the starch on his coat. Wainwright hadn't sent thugs. He'd sent professionals. Just like war. Tobias moved to the back window and tapped twice in rhythm, then once sharply. The curtain moved a fraction. Ezra's face appeared. Then vanished. Moments later, the door opened an inch. Tobias slipped in. The house was dark inside, all lanterns doused save one flickering oil lamp set low on the hearth. Hester stood by it, toddler on her hip, face set and unreadable. Ezra barred the door behind Tobias without a word. Amos clutched the iron poker with both hands, knuckles white. Ruthie trembled silently in a corner, holding the old Bible in her lap like it could still the storm. "They're here," Tobias said. "We know," Hester replied. Ezra pointed to the ladder leading to the loft. "We've got glass across the windows, cans on the fence line. I packed the bags like you said. I didn't say you'd need them tonight." "You didn't have to." Tobias looked at the boy, something like pride sparking behind his grim expression. He turned to Hester. "When I say run, you take them west. And if you fall, don't wait to bury me." Her lips tightened. She handed him the toddler without hesitation. Millie clung to his neck instinctively, burying her face in his collar. Tobias handed her back, gentle but quick. "Get to the root cellar. Stay low. No light, no sound." "What about you?" He looked at the window. "I've got unfinished business." Outside, the first boot hit the porch step. Then another. Ezra stood beside him now, shovel in hand, Amos behind him. Tobias gritted his teeth. He didn't want them in this. But they were already in it. He opened the door fast and low. The man on the porch spun, surprised but not enough. Tobias fired. The shot tore through the man's leg, dropping him with a shout. Not fatal, intentional. Chaos erupted. Another figure charged from the side, shouting, rifle raised. Ezra slammed the shovel across his ribs, knocking him clean off the porch, screaming now both from him and from behind where others began charging. Gunfire cracked from the tree line. Tobias ducked behind the porch beam, returning fire. He aimed low, always low, not out of mercy, out of intent. A wounded man screamed, a dead man silenced. 2 men dropped, one screamed for help, another staggered back, cursing. Then, silence. No return fire. Tobias waited. Ezra's breath came in gasps beside him. Then in the stillness, a voice called out. Not from the yard. From the woods. "Mr. Brand." It was calm. Too calm. "Wainwright." Of course he came. Tobias stood slowly, shotgun down but not lowered. He stepped forward off the porch into the open. "Wainwright," he said flatly. The man emerged from the darkness like a shadow peeling off night, impeccably dressed, not a drop of sweat on his brow. "You've made a mess." Tobias didn't blink. "I warned you. You shot my men. They weren't guests." Wainwright smiled. You think this ends with gunfire. You think this little stand of yours means anything. Tomorrow I send a writ. This valley belongs to the council now. You'll be dust. You want me dust? Tobias asked. Do it now. Silence. Wainwright didn't lift a hand. Didn't draw. He didn't have to. He snapped his fingers. 3 more men stepped from the shadows, armed steady. Tobias could feel Ezra behind him shift, readying the shovel again. Wainwright sighed. Always the fool with the hammer, he muttered. Fine, burn it. The order echoed like thunder. One man lit a torch. Another pulled a bottle from his belt, oil sloshing. Tobias raised the shotgun. He wouldn't get them all, but he'd get enough. Then, from the ridge behind them, a shout. Drop it. A new voice. Unfamiliar. Then another. And another. Figures appeared along the ridge, lanterns in hand, rifles ready. It was the Taylors. The Hammonds. Old Man Rusk. People Tobias hadn't seen in months. Farmers. Widows. Widowers. Neighbors who once whispered, who once turned away. But not now. Now they stood with weapons drawn. Wainwright turned slowly, gaze sweeping the ridge. You brought a mob, he sneered. No, Tobias said, they came on their own. Wainwright's lip curled. Don't be stupid, he said, raising a hand. You think this matters? Tobias didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because the torchbearer dropped his flame. The others followed. No one fired. Wainwright stood alone now. Even his men stepped back. Outnumbered. Outwilled. Outfought. Tobias walked forward. Closer. Close enough to look the man in the eye. This land isn't yours, he said. These people aren't yours. They're not a line on your ledger. Wainwright didn't blink. You'll regret this. Maybe, Tobias said, but not tonight. Wainwright turned, stiff as iron, and marched into the dark. No one followed. Tobias exhaled. The kind of breath a man holds when he doesn't know if it's his last. Behind him, Ezra finally let go of the shovel. And from inside the cabin, Ruthie whispered the words Tobias never thought he'd hear again. Pa. He turned. She wasn't looking at her brothers. She was looking at him. And she smiled. The night stretched on long after Wainwright vanished into the trees, swallowed by a silence too thick to be peace. No one moved at first, not Tobias, not the townsfolk who stood on the ridge, not the wounded men groaning softly in the field. Even the wind seemed unsure what to do next. The fires had been stamped out, the torches dropped and smothered in dirt. And yet the heat lingered, not just in the air but in the blood, in the breath, in the sharp, trembling edge of what almost was. Then Hester stepped out of the cabin. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes swept over the field, the men, the broken rifle that lay near the porch steps. She saw Ezra holding the bent shovel like a sword, saw Amos crouched just inside the doorway with a stick clutched like a spear. Ruthie clung to the windowsill, Millie asleep in her lap, and then she saw Tobias. Standing in the center of it all. Not triumphant, not afraid, just still. She walked to him and stood beside him. The people on the ridge began to descend, slowly at first, like deer testing uncertain ground. Some had tears on their cheeks. Some had rifles still raised, but one by one they came. A woman with braided gray hair knelt beside one of the wounded and checked his pulse. A man in a patched coat helped lift another who'd taken buckshot to the leg. They weren't there for blood. They were there for witness. Old Man Rusk approached first, leaning hard on his cane, eyes sharp beneath his thick white brows. Told myself I wouldn't get involved, he muttered. Then I saw the smoke. You walked from town? Tobias asked. Didn't walk, rode halfway. Horse gave out, walked the rest. He looked around at the damage, at the wounded, at the broken gate. Man tries to mind his own, but there's a line, Rusk said. They crossed it tonight. Others gathered close. The Taylors, the Bensons, even young Clara from the dry goods store, with soot still on her apron and a pistol she probably didn't know how to use tucked into her waistband. We heard, Clara said quietly. About the family, about the council. You heard right, Hester said. She didn't apologize for it. Didn't need to. One of the townsmen, Earl Hammond, scratched at his chin. They said you stole M. Tobias met his gaze. No one steals what's already been thrown away. There was a pause. And then Earl nodded. Well, guess that makes M ours now. Tobias didn't expect the relief that washed through him. It wasn't loud. Wasn't a cheer or a whoop of victory. Just the slow exhale of tension from a dozen bodies. People who had finally decided not to look away. Ruthie ran out the door then, barefoot and half asleep, and barreled into Tobias with a sob that cracked straight through his ribs. He caught her, stumbled slightly, then dropped to his knees to hold her properly. Millie stirred inside, and Hester scooped her up, resting her against her shoulder with a tenderness carved by years of hardship. Ezra stepped beside them, blinking rapidly like he'd forgotten how to stop bracing for impact. They came for us, he whispered. And we're still here, Tobias said. The next morning, the sun rose on a valley transformed. Not by fire. By choice. The people who had come in the night did not leave. They stayed, helped, rebuilt, fetched water, dug trenches to keep runoff from flooding the barn. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Tobias Brand now hammered nails into his fence posts. Women who once whispered about the Boone family's size brought jars of preserved pears and shirts stitched by hand. Tobias didn't ask them to. Neither did Hester, but something unspoken had shifted in the town's bones. Maybe it was the way Ezra limped but refused to sit down. Maybe it was the bruises on Amos's arms, or the way Ruthie sang again when she thought no one was listening. Maybe it was the way Tobias stood watch on the porch through the night, not in fear, but in duty. But they stayed. And the world, just for a breath, bent in their favor. By the end of the week, word had spread. Not just through Larkspur, but to every neighboring town and ranch within 50 miles. The Brand place was under dispute, they said, that a man named Tobias had taken in a giant family and stood against the council, that a woman named Hester had defied a system meant to swallow her children whole, that the town had rallied. That fire had come and been turned back. Wainwright had gone silent. But silence, Tobias knew, was not surrender. It was strategy. And it didn't last. On the 9th day, a letter arrived by courier, not from Wainwright. From the state. Delivered by a woman in a gray suit, with spectacles too small for her sharp face. Tobias met her at the gate. Hester stood on the porch behind him, arms crossed, Millie balanced on one hip. I'm here to inform you, the woman said coolly, that your property is now under federal review. Any further violence or obstruction will be treated as rebellion. Tobias said nothing. She handed him the envelope, then turned and left without waiting for acknowledgement. Inside the envelope was a single line. The family unit at parcel 114 will be relocated by force on the 30th. Tobias looked at the date. 3 days. 3 days until Wainwright returned. Only this time he'd have permission. And likely soldiers. That night the town gathered. Not just the few from before. Dozens. Every rancher, merchant and farmer who'd heard the tale and come to see for themselves. They packed into the barn, lanterns swaying, children on laps, hands calloused from work clenching over knees and arms and hearts. Tobias stood before them. Not to plead. Not to beg. To tell the truth. I didn't bring them here to start a war, he said, but I won't stand by and let a man take children like cattle. Ezra stood too. My sister's 3 years old, he said. She cries at night but never out loud. She thinks if she makes a noise, someone will come take her. He didn't have to say more. The room shifted. A woman near the front, Rachel Ayers, stood up. My brother's got a wagon, he'll come. Old man Rusk raised his cane. They come for one of us, they come for all of us. The tailor spoke next. We've got 4 rifles, 1 with a scope. Someone else shouted, what about the sheriff? He ain't coming. Well, then we stand. The barn roared, not with anger but with resolve. They made their choice. They wouldn't give the family up. They wouldn't go quiet. And if Wainwright brought an army, they'd meet it. The next morning, Tobias sent Ezra and Amos to the ridgeline with scopes and mirrors. If soldiers approached, they'd flash signals. Ruthie stayed close to her mother, helping grind corn and clean the cabin. Hester wrapped Millie in a sling and moved steadily between chores and plans. They stacked barrels at the fence, dug fire pits. A week ago, Tobias was alone on this land. Now, 30 people slept on the field in tents and bedrolls, ready. Not for violence, but for defense. He walked the rows at dusk, nodding to neighbors, clasping shoulders of boys younger than Ezra who still held hunting rifles like they meant it. He found Clara sewing bandages by firelight, found Earl whittling steaks. And when the sky turned black, he looked east, waited, and prayed, not for mercy, but for the strength to see it through. They came on the 30th, right at dawn. 6 wagons, 20 mounted men, and a flag flying high, the emblem of the new state. The crowd at Brand's place was already awake, already waiting. Wainwright rode at the front, smiling. Tobias met him at the gate. "Morning," the man said. "Looks like a party. Uninvited guests." Wainwright dismounted slowly. He wore a fine coat, fine gloves, and boots polished enough to reflect the sunrise. "You've had your fun," he said, "but this ends now. Stand aside." "No." Wainwright raised a hand. "Then you'll be removed." He gestured. Men moved forward. Rifles raised. And that's when the ridge lit up. 3 mirrors flashed in sequence. 1, 2, 3. Ezra's signal. A second force was coming. From the north. Unexpected. Tobias turned to Wainwright, calm as ever. "You should have brought more men." For a moment the field stood still as a breath caught in the throat of the land. Wainwright's gloved hand froze midair. The signal to advance held just inches from execution. The flash of the third mirror from the northern ridge had struck like a thunderclap in the minds of those who knew how to read the land. It meant only one thing. Another force was approaching, one he hadn't accounted for. Tobias didn't smirk. He didn't speak. He simply stepped back from the gate and let the silence press on Wainwright's chest like a slow, tightening noose. "What is this?" Wainwright muttered, eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "More of your theatrics." Tobias answered with quiet certainty, "That's not my show." He turned, whistled low and sharp. From the tree line behind the cabin, figures began to emerge, slow at first, deliberate but unmistakable. These weren't farmers with pitchforks or young boys clutching their daddy's rusted shotgun. These were riders, hardened, dusty, veterans of bloodied borders and wild frontiers. Some wore Union blue faded to gray, others Confederate grays bleached by sun and time. None wore insignias anymore. They didn't need to. Their faces said enough. One of them, a woman with a scar across her jaw and a rifle strapped across her back, rode forward and tipped her hat toward Tobias. "Brand," she said, "heard you needed help holding the line." He gave a single nod. "Appreciate you coming, Mara." She looked over the ridge, at Wainwright's soldiers frozen in place. "Shame we got out of bed for this. I've seen rattlers with more bite." Wainwright turned slowly, his jaw working, fury rising like bile. "You think some drifters and washed-up guns make a difference. These men are state militia, sworn, paid." Mara chuckled, a low sound like boots on gravel. "So were mine, before the state forgot how to pay anyone without a title." Another rider rode up beside her, broad-shouldered, eyes hidden behind dark glass. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Tobias knew the man, Josiah Grant. Quiet, methodical, and patient as death itself. More riders followed. By the time the full count crested the rise, there were nearly 2 dozen. Tobias hadn't summoned them. Word had done that on its own. You don't build a reputation by shouting. You build it by standing still when others run. And Tobias Brand had stood still. Wainwright took a step back. "You're interfering with federal jurisdiction," he barked, voice sharp with panic now disguised as authority. "You're threatening children," Tobias answered, louder now, his voice carrying across the field, across the wagons, and all the way to the porch where Ruthie stood clutching the rail with both hands. That ain't jurisdiction. That's cowardice. Hester stepped out behind her daughter. She wore her size like armor now. No more shawl to hide her shoulders. No more bent head. She stood tall, Millie cradled in one arm, her other hand resting on Amos's shoulder as he squinted toward the field with narrowed eyes. Wainwright turned red. This is treason. No, said Tobias, this is resistance. The word cracked through the morning air like a shot, not fired from a gun but from a mouth too long closed. Behind Wainwright, his own men shifted. They weren't hardened killers. They were bureaucrats in uniforms, paid $1 a day to enforce paper rules. And now they were looking at riders who'd survived worse for less. One of the soldiers lowered his rifle. Then another. Wainwright spun. I gave an order. And we didn't sign up for a firing squad, one of them muttered. Another stepped back. Wainwright's hand trembled now. You'll all be punished. The state will. What state? Mara interrupted. The one that sends children to factories and puts prices on families. You're not worth the bullets, Wainwright spat. That's why we brought our own, Josiah said softly. Wainwright's men broke then, not with violence but with shame. One by one they turned their horses, walked away. Some dropped their weapons in the dirt. Others didn't look back. In minutes, the field that had been poised for war held only one figure left standing, Luther Wainwright, chairman of the Larkspur Development Council. Alone. Surrounded. Defeated. Tobias stepped forward. You can go, he said, but you walk no horse, no escort. You're joking. Not even a little. Wainwright looked around. No eyes met his. Not one soul in that field would raise a finger to help him now. He dropped his briefcase. And walked. The sound of his boots crunching the dry grass was louder than gunfire. Afterward there was no celebration. Only silence. And then work. The townsfolk gathered the rifles left behind. They loaded the wounded onto wagons and sent them back with warnings. The riders who'd come to help didn't linger. They nodded once, offered quiet goodbyes, and rode off the way they came, like ghosts. Mara tipped her hat to Hester. Josiah clasped Tobias's arm once in silent respect. And then they were gone. The field emptied. Only the family remained. Tobias sat on the porch as the sun climbed, rifle resting across his knees. Ruthie curled up beside him, her breath steady now. Ezra sat sharpening a stick into a point, not because he needed a weapon, but because his hands didn't know how to stop. Amos slept on the floor inside the cabin, Millie curled against his back. Hester leaned against the doorway, her face soft now, but eyes still tracking the edges of the horizon. Will they come again? She asked. Tobias looked toward the eastern ridge. Probably. She waited. But next time, he said, we won't be alone. That night the family ate by firelight. No guests, no neighbors, no riders. Just them. A real meal, eggs and potatoes and what meat was left from the smokehouse. They laughed, awkward and unsure at first, as if joy were a language they hadn't spoken in years. Ruthie told a story about the goat who ate Ezra's boot. Amos showed off the sharpened sticks he'd hidden under the floorboards. Even Millie clapped once, giggling without knowing why. Tobias didn't speak much. But he smiled. And Hester saw it. She didn't say anything. Just took his hand beneath the table. Held it there. Steady. In the weeks that followed, the family became something more than legend. They became proof. It came quietly this time. No smoke, no letters nailed to doors, just a knock at the gate and a single rider in a dust-colored coat. His horse was lean, the kind that had traveled far. He didn't wear a badge, but he didn't need one. Tobias met him halfway down the path. You brand? The man asked. I am. I come on behalf of Judge Lucius Monroe, Circuit Court out of Clear Creek. Tobias's fingers flexed slightly, not toward his weapon, but toward the weight of caution. What does the judge want? Not your land, not your family. He wants a testimony. What kind? Truth. The man handed him a sealed envelope, nodded once and turned to go. Tobias watched him vanish down the trail before opening the letter. It was short. Mr. Brand. Word travels slow but long in these parts. I've read the accounts. I've heard the rumors. And I've seen what men like Wainwright leave in their wake. I'd like you to come speak before the court. Your words, your story, your stand. Not for show. For reckoning. If you decline, I understand. If you come, justice might begin to learn again. Judge L. Monroe. Tobias read the letter twice. Then a third time. He didn't reply immediately. He didn't speak of it to Hester that night. Not because he was hiding it, but because he was weighing it. The burden of stepping into rooms that had long been sealed shut. The risk of leaving the family even for a few days. The danger of what truths might bring when spoken too loud. But the next morning, he handed the letter to Ezra. The boy read it, jaw tight, shoulders squared. "You're going?" he asked. Tobias nodded once. Ezra didn't argue. Instead, he said, "We'll be here when you come back." And somehow, that mattered more than anything. Clear Creek was a 4-day ride. Tobias took only what he needed, no rifle, just a revolver tucked beneath his coat and the letter folded tight into his vest pocket. He passed through towns with names he barely remembered, waved at children who pointed from porches, nodded at strangers who gave him curious looks. He spoke little, slept beneath the stars, let the rhythm of the road quiet the knots in his chest. When he reached the courthouse, the clerk didn't ask for his name. She simply said, "They're expecting you," and led him inside. The courtroom wasn't large. A single row of benches, a judge's platform built from local oak, a handful of officials, some in coats too clean for a place like this, others who looked like they'd walked from their farms just to bear witness. Judge Monroe sat at the bench. Older than Tobias expected, thin, pale, but with eyes like coals under ash burning slow but deep. He gestured for Tobias to come forward. "Mr. Brand," he said, "do you swear to speak truth?" "I do." And then, for the first time since Bitter Hollow had tried to sell a family for $5, Tobias told the whole story. From the auction block, to the knock at his door, to the fire, the threat, the stand. He spoke of Hester, of Ezra, of children who refused to give up, of a woman too large for the narrow places society gave her, and a system that tried to turn people into property. He did not rage. He did not cry. He spoke like a man building a fence post, slow, deliberate, driving the facts deep enough to hold. And when he finished, the room held its breath. Judge Monroe looked down at the paper before him, then back up. "You know what you did was against the ordinances," he said. "I know," Tobias replied. "You took them in without approval. You violated property reassignment law. You ignored direct orders from state officials." "I did." Monroe leaned forward. "And I'd have done the same," he said. The air left the room like a rush of wind from a canyon. Tobias blinked. "I beg your pardon." Monroe raised a hand. "I sat silent too long. I let men like Wainwright carve the land into pieces and assign value by weight and width. I let fear of chaos birth a system worse than any storm. And now I want the truth spoken, so it doesn't happen again." Tobias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The gavel struck wood, and the record was sealed with his words inside it. He returned to the valley with no parade, no escort, no fanfare. Just a quiet nod from the gatekeeper in Clear Creek and a bag a little heavier with new weight papers, ones that bore new names, ones that listed the Boone family as free, not pending, not reassigned, just free. When he reached the porch, Ruthie was the first to see him. She didn't shout, just bolted down the steps barefoot, hair flying, arms open. Ezra stood next. Then Amos. Then Hester. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. He held out the papers. She took them, looked once, and pressed her forehead to his chest. They didn't speak. Not right away. Millie babbled and clapped. Amos grinned like sunrise. Ezra wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and pretended he was rubbing sweat. And Tobias, he finally let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to fight again. Not every day. Not every year. Just enough to make sure that no family ever stood on a block with a price around their necks again. The papers were framed 2 days later, not because they needed to be, but because Ezra insisted. He built the frame himself, using old barn wood Tobias had kept stored behind the shed. Each corner was imperfect, uneven by a finger's width, and the glass had a smudge they never wiped away. But it hung in the center of the cabin wall above the hearth, where the light from the fire always touched it. Hester called it their shield. Amos said it was proof they'd won. But Tobias looked at it and thought only one thing: we are not for sale. Life didn't slow after the court's ruling. It settled, and in settling it deepened. The valley that had once felt like a hiding place became a home, not just for them but for others. Folks came through with their own stories, their own burdens. A widower and his son who'd lost their farm in a bad debt deal. A pair of sisters from the east with nowhere left to go. An old preacher who didn't preach anymore, but taught Amos how to whittle crosses and Ezra how to shape fence wire into snares. The cabin grew louder, livelier, but not chaotic. The chaos had been the silence before, the kind that curled around the soul like smoke, choking off hope. Now there was laughter. Real laughter. It rang through the trees when Amos tripped into the creek while chasing a stubborn goat. When Ruthie played her invisible fiddle for a crowd of chickens who clucked in confused rhythm. When Millie learned to say no and meant it, even to Tobias, especially to Tobias. He took it in stride. Hester watched them all with eyes that had once known only sorrow. She smiled more now, cooked with rhythm again, walked with purpose. She didn't hide in town. She brought her children in proudly, letting the folks of Larkspur look them in the eye or not at all. And most did. They offered greetings, sometimes awkward, sometimes warm, but always sincere. Even Clara from the dry goods store asked Ruthie to help sweep once a week, not because the child needed the work, but because Clara didn't want her shop to feel empty anymore. Ezra turned 17 that winter. Tobias handed him the deed to a half-acre just east of the barn, told him it was his to build on. Ezra didn't speak for a long moment. Then he nodded, swallowed hard, and said, "Guess I better learn to build something that won't fall." "You already did," Tobias told him. Spring came late that year, but it came with purpose. The fields, once barren, exploded in green. The goats fattened, chickens laid daily, and Tobias found himself pausing more often on the porch by the water trough under the wide sky just to feel it all settle around him. He had not expected this. He had not asked for it. But somewhere along the line, while fighting to save someone else's children, he had saved himself. He still bore the old grief. Some wounds never stopped aching, but he no longer wore it like armor. He let it rest now, inside him, quiet, beside the new things that filled the empty places. Family. Laughter. A second chance. And on Sundays they sang. Not because the preacher demanded it, not even because they always knew the tune, but because voices raised together were stronger than silence. Tobias didn't sing loud, but he hummed, and Ruthie always elbowed him when he missed a note. The people of Larkspur began to change too. Maybe it was the story. Maybe it was the faces of the Boone children that refused to match the lies they'd once believed. Or maybe it was just time. But fences were mended between neighbors. The auction block was torn down, not replaced, just burned. That ash fed the soil come planting season, and the first crop that rose from it was sweeter than anyone remembered. Judge Monroe returned once, quietly, unannounced. He walked the property with Tobias, nodded at the clean rows, the mended gate, the children darting between chicken coops. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Sometimes," Tobias said, "but then I remember this place is built on staying." Monroe nodded. "I've seen men stand tall in court, but never like you did." "I didn't stand alone." "No, you didn't." He left behind another envelope, this one sealed with a different mark. It granted legal immunity for any who sought shelter under the brand Homestead, signed, dated, and authorized by the district judge himself. Tobias folded it and put it in the Bible Ruthie left on the shelf. They never needed to show it. Not once. Years passed. The valley changed. Children grew. Millie learned to run, then read, then argue with Amos, who by then had started his own garden and declared himself chief of the carrots. Ruthie became the voice of the family, confident, bold, quick-witted, and brave. Ezra built his home next to the old one, not large but solid, and he married Clara in a ceremony behind the barn where the goats tried to eat the hem of her dress and no one minded. Hester cried that day, quietly, but Tobias saw it. She didn't apologize. She shouldn't have. Even Tobias, who had sworn off ever calling a place home again, found himself sketching plans in the dirt with Amos, dreaming of another fence line, another well, another future. And when travelers passed through, drifters, mothers with children, men with haunted eyes, they were offered stew, shelter, and rest. No questions asked. Some stayed. Some didn't. But they all left with something more than what they came with. That was the way of the valley now. One evening, just before the sun dipped behind the hills, Tobias stood on the porch, hands on the rail, watching the sky bloom orange and violet. Hester joined him, wiping her hands on her apron, her braid loose for once. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "The auction?" She nodded. He took a long breath. "Every day." "Why did you do it?" she asked again, as she had once before. "You didn't know us, didn't owe us anything." He turned to her. "I was alone," he said, "and I heard someone knock." She reached for his hand, their fingers worn and calloused from different kinds of labor, but meeting all the same. "And now, I ain't alone anymore." The wind whispered through the trees. Chickens clucked softly from their roosts. Laughter spilled from the barn, where Ruthie was teaching Millie how to whistle. Ezra was hammering something again, probably unnecessary. Amos had likely gone fishing without bait again, just for the quiet. And Tobias Brand, who once lived alone with his silence and sorrow, stood with a giant family that never should have been his. But was. Completely. And when he looked at them, when he saw their size and their hearts, and the way they took up space without apology, he thought of the auction block, the price set at $5, and how every man who didn't bid had missed the greatest bargain this world ever offered. Because you can't measure the worth of family. And you sure can't buy it. Not really. You claim it. You fight for it. You live for it. And if you're lucky, you're chosen back. Tobias was. And it saved his life. Just like he'd saved theirs.